Hi there, and thank you for watching. This is the first in a series of 3 short videos just discussing the question, can we trust the New Testament? I'm going to start by giving you a short outline of what I'm going to say and how these videos are going to work so that we know what's happening ahead of time. First up, we're going to have a bit of basic context because it's important and we don't always talk about it in this kind of setting. And then in each video we're going to go through a series of important questions which people often ask about whether we can trust the New Testament, and we're going to look at them in turn. I'm also going to spend far more time on the Gospels and on Acts than on the rest of the New Testament. That's partly because they're the majority of the New Testament. It's also because they have far more historical references in. It's much easier to assess their historical reliability. And also when the letters then make historical references, it's largely to things we know about already from the Gospels. First up then, historical context. The New Testament is a series of documents. We don't know exactly when most of them were written, but everyone agrees they were written in the second half of the 1st century AD in the Eastern Mediterranean, so in a swathe from Rome across to Greece, Turkey and Israel. In that region at the time, only about 10% of the population knew how to read or write. Paper was rare and expensive. Erasable wax tablets were much more common, or graffiti carved on stone or bits of pottery. And crucially, the book hadn't really been invented either. People had worked out how to stick bits of paper together, but the technology for making a book the length of a modern paperback was still a few hundred years away. For example, the Aeneid by Virgil was written about 100 years before the New Testament. It's about half the length of a fairly short modern novel at about 70,000 words. But it's made up of 12 books. A copy of the Aeneid at the time of Jesus would have been 12 big pieces of paper rolled up as scrolls. And they couldn't be printed. Printing is over 1,000 years in the future. If you wanted another copy of a book, you needed to find someone with a lot of spare paper, which is expensive, who could take the time to copy it all out by hand. It's called a manuscript, meaning that it was written by hand rather than printed. Later on, of course, that gets to be one of the major purposes of monks and monasteries, but they're still 300 years in the future as well. So what writing do we have from that period? Well, we have stuff that was carved on stone or pottery, but it's difficult to fit much actual content in like that. Most paper from that period has not lasted. A few bits of paper have though, especially paper that's been kept undisturbed in warm, dry conditions. And that brings us to our first big question. Given all of this, can we trust that the New Testament we have today is the New Testament that was written down in the 1st century AD? After all, we don't have the original copies. But then we don't have the original copies of anything that was written down on paper in that period. What we do have is copies, lots and lots of copies. And they might not be copies of the original, but copies of copies of copies, spread out over the whole Eastern Mediterranean and some from further afield. And as you might expect, there's a whole academic field about how to reconstruct the original text of a document when all we have is copies. It's called textual criticism. And it's worth just comparing some of the figures for the New Testament with some of the other documents of a similar age. For example, the other author based in Israel from the 1st century, whose work has survived to the modern day, is the historian Josephus. He's our major source for a lot of the material about the war between Israel and Rome, which led to the destruction of the temple in AD 70. And when you come to Josephus, there's 120 manuscripts in Greek and 170 manuscripts in Latin. Or take Tacitus. Tacitus was a Roman historian. He's one of our major sources for what was going on with the Roman emperors from Tiberius through to Nero, so at the time of Jesus. We know from early sources that his annals took up 30 books, but half of them are missing today. Books 1 to 6 survive in only one single copy, and there are 31 manuscripts covering the rest. In fact, from the whole classical period, before the invention of the modern book, few works have more than a couple of hundred manuscripts, and most of them have far less. Now, by contrast, there are about 5,300 surviving New Testament manuscripts in Greek, and another 20,000 or so translated into other languages. Noted classicist Giorgio Pascali, summarizes the evidence on the New Testament like this: "No other Greek text is handed down so richly and credibly." Just to give you an idea what we're talking about, here's the oldest verified bit of the New Testament that we have. It's a fragment of John's Gospel. We can tell it's from the early 100s AD. It's clearly part of a larger scroll, but this is the only bit that survived. The oldest complete or nearly complete copies of the New Testament we have are also the two oldest books in the world which are long enough to hold the New Testament. They're from the early 300s AD, probably around the time the New Testament was finally agreed on. We'll talk about that later. They're both handwritten, of course, and they both survived in ancient libraries, one in St. Catherine's Monastery in Egypt, and then in the British Museum, the other in the Vatican Library in Rome. And after those two early manuscripts, there are loads, especially from monastery libraries all over the Roman Empire and even further afield. Here's one from Ethiopia from the late 300s, and since I've got Irish ancestry, here's one from the 800s from Ireland. Now, with all these thousands of Bibles having been copied out by hand, and often being copies of copies of copies, it's inevitable there will have been some mistakes and variations. If you read skeptics like Bart Ehrman on this, you'll find that he says there are about 400,000 differences between the different manuscripts, which is quite impressive since there's only about 138,000 words in the New Testament. But the fact is that because we have a huge number of manuscripts, that works out at about one mistake every 4 pages. And most of them are either really easy mistakes, like spelling a place name wrong, or really understandable ones. For example, and this is one of the biggest ones in terms of numbers and in terms of length, Jesus famously gives the Lord's Prayer twice in Matthew 6 and Luke 11. And the two versions use slightly different words, and neither of them's quite the same as the version that ended up being mostly used in church services, which ends with "The kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours now and forever." And what you find is that the monks who prayed the church version several times a day tended to end up putting words from the church version they knew well into Matthew and Luke's versions, and sometimes getting Matthew and Luke's versions muddled up as well. And so textual criticism has come along to try to work out what the original text was from all the slightly different copies that we've got. And you know what? They're really confident that they've got it about right, and the few variations between manuscripts don't actually make any difference to the understanding of the text. You can even get editions of the New Testament in Greek which tell you what all the manuscript variations are for the different verses, and which manuscripts have got them. Here's mine, and here's an example page. As you can see, it tells you what the different manuscripts say that word might be. And if there's a variation between manuscripts that they're not completely sure about which is right, and it makes a difference to the meaning, most Bible translations put it in a footnote. And one of the things I think is great about this is not only are the differences between the different manuscripts actually pretty minor in terms of meaning, but also that we're pretty open about them. It's easy enough to buy a Bible or to get a Greek New Testament that tells you what all the variations are and lets you make your mind up for yourself. So to conclude this question, we can be far more confident that the New Testament we have is as it was written than for any other document written in the ancient world. That includes all the Roman historians, including Caesar, including Homer, including everything that is used as the basis for understanding ancient history. And if we want to, we can get a Bible like this, or like a New Testament with footnotes, and we can look at it, and we can see what the slight variations between the manuscripts are, and we can see that it doesn't make a difference to what the New Testament means on anything that's really important. If you'd like to read more on the whole area of textual criticism, including going into some stuff in quite a lot of detail, this is quite a helpful book, Myths and Mistakes in New Testament Textual Criticism. Thank you so much for tuning in. Do make sure you watch the next video as well, as we think about, so was the New Testament manuscripts as originally written, were they actually reliable? Do they say what actually happened?